Welcome to Lantern Voices, a podcast by Lantern Publishing and Media. The opinions and information expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of Lantern Publishing and Media Incorporated. Welcome back to Lantern Voices. I am Luisa, your host for today's episode. We are welcoming to the podcast today author Isabella La Rocca González. Isabella is an activist and photography artist. Her book, Censored Landscapes, was published last fall by Lantern, and it is truly one of a kind. In Censored Landscapes, Isabella brought essays and poems in conversation with an astounding photographic work. The book's photographs show landscapes that are not commonly seen out there, animal farms. In our conversation, she shared the challenges that she had to overcome when capturing those images. She talked about the animals that are depicted in her book and about her work. We are also bringing a special gift for everyone who stays until the very end of the podcast today. So after the interview, stay here with us to know what it is. Now, let's welcome Isabella La Rocca González to the podcast. Well, Isabella, thank you very much for joining us here today at Lantern Voices. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to have this discussion with you.
I was rereading the book yesterday, actually, when I was taking a look at our questions, rereading the book. And I am always very happy to chat with the authors, especially when I have the reading fresh in my brain, because then you'll see I will add some of my own questions in the middle of this just because I can and I have you here.
Great.
It was a great book. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
I will start off with the title of your book, Censored Landscapes. Right at the introduction, you mentioned that, and I'm quote, in more than half of the U.S. state legislatures, the industry, so the animal slaughter industry, has attempted to pass GGAG laws that criminalize photographing sites of animal agriculture. What is the justification they use, and why do you think that happens?
Well, the justification, I believe, is twofold. They consider all of those animals their private property. That is legally what animals are. Animals are private property. Even though corporations are considered persons, animals are not and have no rights of personhood. So they consider these animals their own private property. I suppose they also trot out the issue of biosecurity, which, as we know, would not be a problem if they were not intensively confining and exploiting animals. So that is another issue that comes up with these laws. But the reality, the reason that these laws exist and continue to try to exist is secrecy and opacity. They do not want people to know about the reality of this industry, because if people really knew how atrocious it is, I think more and more people would try and stay as far away as possible from it. But they're still really trying. When I wrote the manuscript for the book, they were in effect in 6 states. Currently, ag-gag laws are in effect in 11 states, including the state where I currently live, Kentucky. So they really, really don't want people to know, and that's the real reason for ag-gag laws. And even though I did not break any laws while I was creating this book, I was not welcome anywhere near any of these facilities. I was threatened, I was verbally assaulted, and I was chased, even though I was not breaking any laws. In the jurisdictions where many of these facilities are located, law enforcement is always on the side of the livestock operators, no matter who is right.
I think it's wild that you mentioned that corporations are treated as people, but animals are property. I knew those two pieces of information, but I never put 2 and 2 together until you just told me.
That's pretty basic law. Even our companion animals are considered our property. There are animal cruelty laws, but very few of those laws apply to farmed animals, and almost none of them apply to, for example, birds in the animal agricultural industry. So there's still property. They're just sort of, you just, sometimes you're meant to be nicer to them.
Mhm.
But corporations, in this country have a lot of power and increasing amounts of power. For example, the Supreme Court passed Citizens United, which makes money free speech. In other words, you can donate to uh, a politician, and that donation is considered free speech and is not regulated in the way that private property is.
Okay, that is just insane, insane. I think so much of the activist work from the authors I've been talking to lately for this podcast involves being up to date when legislation changes, being up to date on how we can go around things that simply they're there to favor certain companies and certain powerful people, and not to favor the majority, not to favor the animals. So it's very interesting, especially when you mention because there was a component that could have been illegal about what you were doing. Not saying like right or wrong, but you could have gone to the farms that in states that it is illegal and be like, I'm going to photograph it anyway. And instead, what you did is like you stayed within the law and you were like, no, even so, I'm going to find a way to show how wrong this is.
Mhm. In the states where I photographed, what I was doing was not illegal. That doesn't mean I wasn't treated like a criminal, but I was not breaking the law.
Yeah. And I bet that even those people, like, they wished that it was because the way that they treated you is just.
For sure. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
And what made you take that challenge? What made you want to photograph the landscapes of animal farms?
The project started in 2013. This was a year after 50,000 hens were abandoned in a battery cage egg farm. Battery cages are where hens exploited for their eggs are kept for their whole lives. They're intensively confined. And as of the last time I researched this, 70% of hens in the egg industry are kept in battery cages. They are intensively confined. Each hen has less cage to stand on than an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, just to give you a visual on that. And in this facility, 50,000 hens were left by the owners. I think they ran out of money, and so they just left. They left them in these cages to starve without water. 2 weeks later, state officials discovered 17,000 deads, and they began gassing the others. And finally, animal sanctuaries were able to come in and negotiate to take custody of the surviving 4,460, I think, hens. So I decided to go out about a year later and photograph this facility because I'd never really been up close and personal with these kinds of animal farms. Where I grew up, I was very far away from any farms, and even if I hadn't been, I would not have recognized most of the places that I ended up photographing. Many of them just look like warehouses. They don't really, there's no evidence of animals anywhere. And so that was the beginning. That was the first one I photographed. I love landscape photography. I'm a photographer. I kind of explore the world with my camera. And so I set up my tripod. I made some landscapes. It was a beautiful time of day. And I am always very interested in the juxtaposition between something really upsetting and trying to make something beautiful out of it. So that was kind of what I was trying to do, even though I did not succeed when I photographed the interior. The interior was so heinous that there's no way that I was able to make that in any way aestheticized. And that just sort of triggered in my mind, well, I wonder what these other facilities look like. And that just inspired me to start making landscape photographs of these kinds of facilities. And then, of course, in order to balance it, I felt that I had to represent the animals because they are so hidden away. Most of them are never outside. They're in these confined conditions indoors. or these facilities are in remote places, really far out in the middle of nowhere. And I wanted to represent the animals as best as I could. So the first thing that I started doing was researching the number of animals permitted on each of the facilities I photographed. Not easy. That was not easy to do. That's not information that's easily accessible. But I, persisted, and I was able to get pretty accurate numbers about the animals permitted in a number of permitted. That fluctuates, of course, but that was the number that I was looking for. There were a few times when I was not able to get that number. Either it was considered, I forget the legal name, but basically not accessible to the public. And I asked industry experts, people who have degrees in agriculture, for their estimates, or even the environmental organizations that mostly helped me find these numbers. Mostly it was the environmental organizations, which are being dismantled by our current government. But at the time, finally, I found people who were willing to share this information.
Hi there, I'm Hope Bohannick, host of the Hope for the Animals podcast, sponsored by Compassionate Living. Join me on a journey to uncover the heartbreaking and heartwarming aspects of living vegan. My guests cover a variety of issues, but I like to focus on ethics, chickens and sanctuaries, the environment, anti-oppression activism, and the reasons for living vegan. If this sounds good to you, come check out the Hope for the Animals podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts.
I've seen in your book, and I've seen in other, I think Hope Bohannick's book, The Humane Hoax, she also mentions this, how hard it is to find regulations and for all the humane labels and all that, and how hard, especially for birds, how hard it is to find. So how the maximum amount, everything is kind of built for the companies and by the companies that it will benefit. So it's very hard to find this information. It's very interesting to hear about your research.
Yeah, it's really a very, very secretive industry. And in order to keep it secretive, there's a lot of lobbying, and there's kind of a revolving door between industry, powerful leaders in the industry, and the government. So for example, Tom Vilsack, who is the Secretary of Agriculture. I don't know if he still is. I don't know. Things are changing so much in the last, month or so. But during the Obama administration, and again during the Biden administration, he was the Secretary of Agriculture. He was also the president of I believe it's the Dairy Producers Company. So it's just this revolving door between these leaders in industry and the government. So of course they're going to make sure that the regulations benefit them and keep the industry very opaque.
Yes. Mm-hmm. You talk about juxtaposition, and I think that's kind of going to my next question. We have photos of sterile farms, their metal structures, in a beautiful landscape, but still something that is very straightforward, like a warehouse you just mentioned. But we also have photos of the animals, some taken in sanctuaries, some were taken of those animals that are being raised as produce. And you mentioned in the book that the presence of the animals are there so they can act as ambassadors for their species. I think that's beautiful. How was it for you as a photographer to navigate from the hostile scenario of all that warehouse looking and being kicked out of places for photographing it, to looking into the animal's eyes and taking those deep photographies?
It was twofold. On the one hand, it was heartbreaking because I recognized, even the animals in sanctuary, I recognized that they endure unimaginable suffering from birth until, even if they survive in sanctuaries, until they are finally able to live out their lives in a sanctuary. Suffering that I can't even imagine. Most of us don't want to imagine. So in that way, it's awfully heartbreaking. And I just, I just looked into their eyes, and I wanted to apologize profusely for my species and the suffering that we've inflicted on each of them. On the other hand, the connection I was able to make with these animals was just so, I don't even have a word for it. There's no other connection. We connect with each other, we connect verbally, we connect visually. But animals, I believe, have this 360 multidimensional perception. We tend to kind of humans, I think, tend to flatten things out. I mean, just look at how we're all so addicted to our phones, these little flat screens, and we're all just kind of focused on this tiny little flattened thing. Animals don't do that, or non-human animals don't do that. They perceive with so many of their sentences, and their senses are so much broader than ours. Chickens, for example, see more colors than we do, and with more nuance. And so for me to understand that I was being perceived in that way by this other being, and to try to perceive them in that way, was just, it's just a magical thing. One of the things I realized, and I wrote about this in the book, is that we are all so fundamentally connected, and it connects us on a universal level, which for me was a very important insight, that we're not alone in the universe. There's not like Earth and then like maybe some aliens out there that someday we'll connect with. We are all connected on this earth because of the universe. We're of the earth, and non-human animals are of the earth, and we all share DNA, and we share origins. And that level of connection was something that has really, I don't know how to put it, has made me feel in a way much, much more broad in my existence.
It makes sense. And tying that with my next question, one of the topics that you touch in your book is how animal exploitation affects people's health, and not just physical health, mental health. Well, the brain's part of our body, so definitely mental health is physical health too. But not only like our blood systems and everything, but how we behave, how we interact with Earth and the creatures that live in Earth. Historically, based on your book, it has affecting people from not white people. So I guess what I'm mean to bring here is that people who are working at those slaughterhouses, they're not going to be, most of them are not going to be white. They're not going to be wealthy. They're not going to choose to be there. So I would like us to talk a little bit about this, and also about how historically the people from the Americas have had, like, they were forced away from a plant-based diet, because I think that's not something that we hear about it very often.
That's exactly right. It's so ironic that the majority of workers in the animal slaughtering and processing industry, as it's called, are people of color. And the majority of those people are people with Latin American roots. And this is, the term systemic racism, which is trying to be erased from our from our language these days, is very much part of it. It's as you said, this is work that many people don't want to do, and it is kind of relegated to people who are in the least privileged positions. The latest statistic that I found is that about 25% of these workers in this industry are undocumented. Now, this is something that benefits the industry, and that the industry has nurtured. And this is because these workers cannot advocate for themselves. They are kept, in conditions that other workers would not be able to be kept in, because they cannot advocate for themselves for fear of deportation, or even worse. So it really affects a lot people of color, and especially people from Latin American backgrounds.
it's very understandable, especially like I came to the United States to study. It's different, completely different, but I'm also coming from Latin America. And I see with the people, with the communities I work with the communities in the neighborhood that I chose to live to be closer to my heritage. So I live in a very Latin American neighborhood. I see how people sometimes they have to accept whatever comes to their plates, not necessarily because they agree with it. They just associate and they're like, I need to provide for my kids. I need to rent. I need to keep a roof over my head. It is what it is. When you need to, necessity makes you have to do things and not think too much about them. So yeah, it makes total sense. Not only from obviously the data that you bring, because that's unquestionable, but also from the experience that I've been observing and that I've been living myself sometimes.
Yes, and it's not only this issue of health is not just about the workers. It's also that people in less privileged neighborhoods have less access to healthier plant-based foods.
Mhm.
And, that's just the reality. It's almost revolutionary to try and not fall into those systems that are in place.
Mhm.
And the other thing to consider, I think you kind of brought this up, is that North and Central American people before colonization did not farm animals. This the cows, pigs, chickens, goats, sheep were brought to the Americas by the European settler colonialists. The diet in this part of the country was largely plant-based, which is also true in other countries about indigenous peoples. And it's interesting because, sometimes you get this response from, for example, from my mom was Mexican, Mexican American, and, I've gotten sometimes reactions from my cousin, what about carnitas? Like, what about, albondigas? And it's like, you know, that is
Yeah.
a colonialist, that's a heavily colonialist way of eating. Um, and so the whole idea of veganism as some kind of white imposition on people of color is just another bit of propaganda, to demonize a plant-based diet and veganism. It's really, and fundamentally, it's not true. And for example, Cesar Chavez, very prominent Chicano civil rights activist, and he was the founder of the National Farm Workers Association, which is now the United Farm Workers of America. And he was vegan because he recognized that, first of all, social justice has to extend to all sentient beings, and that veganism is a revolutionary act against colonial patriarchal systems.
I was listening to a Brazilian podcast this week with a chef, an Argentinian chef. Her name is Paola Carosella. She's in like MasterChef Brazil, so she's a big deal in Brazil. Not a vegan chef, but something that she mentioned was that kind of get my got my brain engines running for this conversation that we were just saying is I'm from the south of Brazil. She is from Argentina. It's very common in our area to have like the culture of eating red meat, so eating cows in particular. It's interesting to hear her say, especially where she's from. She was mentioning how much of land is being used for pasture and how much of land is being used to cultivate commodities, not necessarily food. And then if you have an investment on that, specifically on the commodities part, you will have cheaper ultra processed food. So people who are not in the higher incomes of society, what they're gonna have to resort to eat cheaper, higher process, ultra processed food. And again, we have another problem, another social economical problem that comes with food, with eating, that a plant based culture would not have. if you focus only on that.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And, the amount of deforestation that is caused by, most specifically, raising cows for food is heartbreaking because, as you know, forests are the lungs of our planet and we're in an environmental crisis. And we've run out of time. It's not like we've got a little bit of time left and we better fix it. We've already run out of time. The bullet is out of the gun, so to speak. And yet, these industries keep marching along, cutting down our precious forests for these unhealthy, cruel products. It's hard to understand how this can continue to go on and on and on.
Yeah. We know the vegan activist community is out there, and we want to connect with each and every one of you. We are proud supporters of initiatives that fight for a more compassionate world for all animals, humans and non-humans alike. For more content on vegan activism, follow Lantern on social media. We are Lantern Publishing and Media on Facebook, at Lantern PM on Instagram, and at Lantern PM Official on TikTok. There's so many facts that bring us a sense of sadness and despair, especially nowadays. I feel like every time I get an email with breaking news, like my heart is already pumping in my chest. I'm like, what now?
Yes.
But also in your book, you bring some other facts that bring a little bit of hope. The sanctuaries, the people that are making the difference, the different people working. So also something that I recently was doing some research for Lantern, and I found out that the number of vegans in the world is still increasing. So that's always good news. So what I want to ask is, in activism and writing a book, how important it is for you to balance the tragic with the hopeful?
I don't really think of it as any kind of activist strategy. I honestly, truly believe that there will come a time when humans will look back with horror at that we ever ate or consumed or exploited other animals. It's such an enormous atrocity that's beyond understanding, and it's not economically or environmentally sustainable. It's thoroughly unhealthy, not only on an individual level, but on a public health level. And sooner or later, this will become glaringly obvious to everyone. And so, if I can enable that change to happen sooner with education, with spreading awareness, I will have lived a good life. That's how I think of activism.
That is beautiful. That's inspiring, really, because again, especially when I was going through your book, then you have like fact, 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 and all the facts. I was just like, so, but then you have a poem, and then you have the photos looking into an animal's eye, and you have, oh, and this like sanctuaries are doing this work. So you can, as a reader, you don't feel like the world's gonna end, which it will be a problem for the cause as well, because, and not only in an activist point of view, but as a person, we have to have hope. If we give up, we just don't do anything anymore.
Exactly, exactly. And if we look back at history, there are a lot of examples where this kind of, efforts have succeeded. Not always 100% as quickly as we would like, but we just have to keep marching toward that goal and believe that we're making a difference and that it will make a difference.
And after concluding the work with specifically Censored Landscapes, so obviously life work is much bigger than that. But after concluding the book, what have you learned?
The most important thing for me that became very clear as I was working on this project is the deep connection between animal agriculture and so many other issues that are so important right now. The connections between the environment, the connections between human health. We're facing another pandemic right now with avian flu, which is the crammed conditions of animal agriculture are ensuring that those pathogens spread quickly and widely. The connections between animal agriculture, as we discussed previously, and worker exploitation and systemic racism, the connections between animal agriculture and economic political structures, the way the government works to prop up these industries. And as we discussed earlier, the connections between colonialism, the connections between animal agriculture and patriarchy. Um, there's so many connections between animal agriculture and the most pressing issues of our time. And if we can address the gross injustice of animal agriculture, then it would go such a long way towards solving these enormous problems that we're facing right now, existential problems.
Has this project encouraged or changed your activism in any way, do you think?
Oh gosh.
That's a tricky one.
That's a tricky question. I'm not sure. This project grew alongside my growing activism, I think. So my activism actually began before I became vegan, which is so weird. I was kind of in the process of becoming vegan, and I started working on the Prop 2, Proposition 2, which was a bill that was passed in California that was meant to allow farmed animals to be able to stand up, turn around, and spread their wings and limbs. And I worked on that. And as I was working on that, I thought, what kind of hypocrite am I? I'm not even, and I was doing all the mental gymnastics that it takes to not be vegan and try to be humane, which is just insane. And I realized, first of all, I'm a hypocrite. Second of all, it's so much work to try and find out what's supposedly humane. Like, is Parmesan cheese from Italy humane? Oh, no, it isn't. Oh, I have to stop eating that. So that was kind of the beginning of my activism. And as I started working on this project, I became much more active with groups in the Bay Area where I was living. I practiced peaceful, nonviolent, protests and actions and community building. So it really has grown as part of my activism. It's hard to tear them apart in any way. And I don't think at this point I can be the person I am without being an activist. It's part of my purpose in life. So that's a hard question to parse down to a simple answer. Sorry.
That's okay. I love complex answers because then we can dive deep into them. You plan on continue taking photos of those landscapes?
Oh gosh. I don't know that I think that my goal was to be as thorough as possible to photograph at least one of all the many different kinds of facilities that exist.
Mhm.
I think I photographed pretty much, I think I represented pretty much every species that is exploited by the animal agricultural industry. I also photographed the different kinds of facilities, of course, where the animals are bred and confined, where the animals are bought and sold, where the animals are like feedlots, where they're kind of prepared for slaughterhouses. And I don't think I have the heart anymore to keep photographing them. I feel like I achieved that goal. I continue to photograph because I've done that since I was a teenager, and that's kind of the way I explore the world. And I've moved on to other projects that also advocate for animals, photographic and artistic projects. And I've also been writing a lot more. That I think it's something I always did, and I started doing a lot more even before I started this project, and it's something that gives me a lot of joy, and I think it is kind of runs parallel to my visual artwork. And all of those are always going to be in service of activism, because I think that's to reduce suffering, I think is the highest goal that I can hope for in my life. And if I can use my skills and talents and my artwork in the service of that, I will have done well with that.
That was lovely. Thank you very much for this chat today. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Oh, thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you. And thank you and Lantern for everything you're doing to spread awareness and to keep enabling this change. We need so many people like you in the world.
Thank you. And we wouldn't be anything without our great authors. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Do you love new books? Do you need more titles about veganism, animal rights, and climate activism on your bookshelf? Then go to lanternpm.org and check out all our books and ebooks available for purchase. You can find anything from beautiful illustrated picture books that introduce children to the values of compassion for our fellow animals, to thoroughly researched nonfiction books that give you all the facts to help you live a healthy vegan life. Go to lanternpm.org and explore all of our books today. This was our interview with Isabella La Rocca González, author of Censored Landscapes. If you stayed here with us until now, it is time to announce our gift for all our podcast listeners. If you're like me, every time I hear about a book in a podcast, I feel like I must read that book. Good news! If you want to get any of the books that have been featured in Lantern Voices ever, and I mean ever, just head over to our ebook store at lanternpm.org and use the coupon LanternVoices25 at checkout. This coupon will give you a 25% off your purchase in any book ever featured in the podcast. So you can get Censored Landscapes, Animal Stories, The Veganic Grower's Handbook, and any other book that was featured in one of our 7 episodes. And it will also be valid for all next episodes. Don't forget, the coupon is valid in our ebook store, so that means you'll be getting a digital file, not a physical book. Remember, the coupon is Lantern Voices and the numbers 2 and 5 all together, no spaces. It will give you 25% off your purchase in our ebook store at lanternpm.org. Thank you for joining us here today. If you're enjoying the podcast, please don't forget to leave a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening to the podcast. It really helps us reach more people. And please also consider giving us a follow on social media. We are at Lantern PM on Instagram, Lantern Publishing and Media on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and at Lantern PM Official on TikTok. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another special guest here at Lantern Voices. See you soon.